On May 20th, 1940, the first prisoners arrived at the new concentration camp established by the SS on the outskirts of Oświęcim. What began as a temporary facility soon became a key component of the Nazi system of repression. Auschwitz wasn't on tourist maps, but every day, trains carrying hundreds of people arrived directly into the heart of the complex between electrified barbed wire fences and roaring chimneys. These weren't tourists, these were prisoners. The journey was the first filter. Cars without windows, without water, without seats. Inside, between 80 and 120 people stood for days. Upon arrival, there were no civil records, just a hand indicating left or right, work or elimination. How did the machinery of extermination really work? What do these previously unseen images reveal? And why were they kept out of the public eye for so long? Auschwitz, the camp that became a death trap. In the spring of 1940, as Nazi Germany consolidated its control over Poland, Reich authorities transformed a former Polish military barracks on the outskirts of the city of Oświęcim into what would become the largest industrial death complex in modern history. The location of Auschwitz was no accident. In southwestern Poland, in a region renamed Upper Silesia by the occupiers, this site offered crucial logistical advantages. Proximity to important railway junctions, sufficient isolation from major urban centers, and a pre-existing infrastructure adaptable to the Reich's objectives. What began as a camp for Polish political prisoners would evolve into a system of 3 interconnected camps designed for detention, forced labor, and ultimately systematic extermination. The railway system became the main artery of the machinery of death. From stations across Europe, transports departed loaded with hundreds of people, uninformed about their true destination. The cars, originally designed to transport livestock or goods, lacked seats, functional windows, or sanitary facilities. Between 80 and 120 people were crammed into each one, forced to stand for journeys that could last up to 10 days. During these hellish journeys, thirst, hunger, and lack of ventilation became increasingly painful. Extreme temperatures amplified the suffering, stifling heat in the summer, causing severe dehydration, and freezing cold in the winter, causing hypothermia. Survivors' accounts describe how the sick, the elderly, and young children often died during the journey, forcing other passengers to share space with the corpses until they reached the camp. The final leg of the journey culminated at the so-called Judenrampe, an unloading platform located between Auschwitz I and Birkenau. Beginning in 1944 with the expansion of the railway, trains arrived directly inside Birkenau, accelerating the extermination process. The moment of arrival was captured in photographs taken by the SS, confused, exhausted faces peering through the small openings in the carriages at a landscape of barbed wire fences and watchtowers. The landing was a scene of controlled chaos. As the gates opened, SS officers accompanied by viciously barking German shepherds shouted orders in German, "Raus! Schnell! Get out! Quickly!" The prisoners, disoriented after days of darkness, hunger and thirst, staggered down into a world of black uniforms, weapons and violence. The first separation occurred immediately, men on one side, women and children on the other. Families that had remained united for years were fragmented in seconds, often without a chance to say goodbye. The selection process was carried out with chilling efficiency. SS doctors, including Josef Mengele, assessed with a glance of seconds who would live and who would die. A simple gesture to the left or right determined opposite fates. The elderly, pregnant women, young children, and the visibly ill or weakened were led directly to the gas chambers under the pretense of receiving a disinfectant shower. Those who appeared strong enough for the job were temporarily spared, though for many it only meant a longer road to death. For those selected as laborers, a systematic process of dehumanization began. First, they were led to search rooms where they had to strip naked, abandoning the last possessions that connected them to their former lives. Both men and women had their hair shaved off completely. This practice, justified as a hygienic measure, also served a psychological purpose, to eliminate individuality, transforming human beings into identical units within an anonymous mass. The assignment of a prisoner number was the next step in the depersonalization process. Using an instrument similar to a needle stamp, camp officials tattooed a numerical sequence on the left forearm of each new prisoner. This painful and humiliating procedure symbolized the final transition. They were no longer named individuals, but rather numbers on an inventory. In the camp's internal administration, these numbers completely replaced their previous identity. The assigned uniform consisted of vertically striped blue and grey garments made of coarse, skin-irritating fabric. The shoes, often mismatched wooden clogs or boots worn from previous use, caused painful blisters. Over this basic clothing, each prisoner was required to wear a coloured triangle sewn across the chest, the colour of which identified their rank within the Nazi classification system. Red marked political prisoners, green common criminals, black those considered asocial, violet Jehovah's Witnesses, and pink homosexuals. Jews, regardless of the reason for their arrest, wore a double yellow triangle forming the Star of David, often superimposed on another colour depending on their subcategory. This visual coding allowed guards to instantly identify the type of prisoner, facilitating differentiated treatment. Jews invariably occupied the lowest rung of this imposed hierarchy, receiving the worst work assignments and the most brutal treatment. Upon completion of the registration process, the prisoners were photographed from 3 different angles for camp records. They were then assigned to specific barracks, where a capo, usually a veteran prisoner with authority delegated by the SS, explained the camp rules to them with a mixture of threats and warnings. The accommodations in the barracks revealed another aspect of systematic dehumanization. Structures designed to house a maximum of 700 people frequently contained more than 1,000. The bunks, built 3-tiered without adequate mattresses, forced them to sleep on straw infested with lice and bedbugs. Every inch was contested in a constant struggle for basic survival. From the very beginning, the new prisoners understood the unforgiving reality of the camp. Any disobedience, slowness, or weakness could result in immediate punishment or execution. The perpetual smoke emanating from the crematorium chimneys, visible from every point in the camp, served as a constant reminder of the fate that awaited those who faltered. For the hundreds of thousands who passed through the Auschwitz entrance crowned with the cynical slogan, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, the process of entry marked the beginning of an existence where death could come in many forms, through exhaustion, disease, starvation, direct violence, or, for many, in the gas chambers. A parallel universe where the norms of civilized society had been suspended and replaced by the implacable logic of a system dedicated to the industrial production of death. The death clock, how Auschwitz worked inside out. The Auschwitz complex was not simply a place of confinement, it functioned as a meticulously designed structure of oppression, where every element of the physical environment and every aspect of daily life served a specific purpose, the maximum exploitation of the prisoners until their final exhaustion. The spatial organization of the complex revealed this intention. Auschwitz I, the main camp, used pre-existing brick barracks arranged in orderly rows. Birkenau, or Auschwitz II, much larger, presented an almost industrial layout with sectors differentiated according to prisoner categories: women's camp, family camp for Roma, transit camp, and quarantine areas. Monowitz, or Auschwitz III, essentially functioned as a slave labor camp serving the German industrial company IG Farben. The entire perimeter was surrounded by electrified barbed wire fences arranged in 2 parallel lines, carrying a current of 6,000 volts, sufficient to cause instant death. Between these lines extended a constantly patrolled surveillance corridor. Observation towers, strategically positioned every 150 meters, housed guards armed with machine guns and powerful searchlights for nighttime surveillance. This system of physical containment was complemented by a constant psychological regime of terror. Within this structure, the barracks displayed deliberately inhumane conditions. At Birkenau, these facilities, originally designed as stables for 52 horses, housed up to 1,000 people in extremely overcrowded conditions. The wooden bunks, arranged in 3 tiers, lacked adequate mattresses, forcing prisoners to sleep on parasite-infested straw. During the Polish winter, with temperatures frequently dropping below -20 degrees Celsius, the lack of thermal insulation and adequate heating led to frostbite and severe hypothermia. The sanitary facilities demonstrated a complete disregard for human dignity. The sanitary blocks consisted of long rows of holes over concrete channels, with no partitions to provide privacy. Access to these spaces was strictly limited to specific times, forcing hundreds of people to complete their basic needs in intervals of just a few minutes. The lack of toilet paper, running water, or adequate washing facilities turned these spaces into hotbeds of infection where diseases such as dysentery and typhus spread. The day at Auschwitz began brutally before dawn. At 4:30 a.m., a metal gong signaled the start of the day. The prisoners had only a few minutes to dress, perform a quick wash if water was available, and prepare the room for inspection. Any delay was punished with beatings or deprivation of food rations. The first daily ritual, the appel or roll call, was one of the most terrifying experiences of the routine. Regardless of the weather conditions, torrential rain, heavy snow, or extreme temperatures, all prisoners had to line up in perfectly aligned rows in the central plaza to be counted. This process could drag on for hours if the numbers didn't match the records. If a prisoner died during the night, his fellow prisoners had to carry the body back to the formation to be counted. After the morning appel, the first food ration of the day was distributed. A dark, bitter liquid that passed for coffee, generally with no real nutritional value. With this breakfast in their stomachs, the prisoners were organized into commandos or work groups according to their assignments. The march to the work sites was carried out in orderly columns, often to the sound of music played by prisoner orchestras, a macabre juxtaposition that intensified the sense of distorted reality. The spectrum of forced labor at Auschwitz encompassed a wide range of activities, all characterized by extreme hardship and dangerous conditions. At the IG Farben factories in Monowitz, prisoners handled toxic chemicals for the production of synthetic rubber, Buna, without adequate protection, suffering chemical burns and progressive poisoning. In nearby quarries, others extracted stone by carrying blocks beyond their physical capacity, under the supervision of kapos who did not hesitate to beat anyone who showed signs of weakness. Within the camp itself, multiple tasks kept the infrastructure running, expanding barracks, dredging drainage channels, maintaining roads, and cleaning latrines. A dedicated group of prisoners worked in the warehouses known as Canada, sorting belongings confiscated from new arrivals, clothing, shoes, eyeglasses, prosthetics, and valuables. These items were processed, packaged, and shipped to Germany for reuse, in a macabre display of economic efficiency. The camp's internal administration combined German bureaucratic precision with a system of delegated control over selected prisoners. The hierarchy of authority within each barrack began with the Blockältester or block leader, usually a senior prisoner, followed by the Stubendienst or assistants, and finally the Kapos in charge of specific work groups. This structure created a system where the prisoners themselves exercised control over their fellow prisoners, generating internal divisions and forced complicity with the oppressive system. The diet was designed to maintain the inmates in a state of chronic malnutrition, calculated to allow approximately 3 months of work before physical collapse. The daily ration rarely exceeded 1,300 calories, less than half the requirement for an adult subjected to intense physical labor. Lunch usually consisted of a liter of watery soup with almost imperceptible pieces of turnip, potato, or cabbage. Dinner consisted of 300 grams of black bread, sometimes accompanied by a spoonful of synthetic margarine or a tiny fragment of substandard sausage. The distribution of these rations generated situations of extreme tension among the prisoners. Those in charge of the distribution, prisoners in privileged positions, frequently favored friends or compatriots, while newcomers or the weakest received even smaller portions. This dynamic of survival eroded conventional notions of solidarity, although notable exceptions also emerged where groups of prisoners organized systems of mutual support based on nationality, language, or ideological affinity. The constant state of hunger had devastating effects. The bodies consumed first their fat reserves, then their muscle tissue, and finally their internal organs. The progression toward the state known as Muslim, the camp's term for prisoners in the terminal stages of malnutrition, was visible. Skeletal face, sunken eyes, slowed movements, inability to concentrate. These advanced cases were invariably selected for the gas chambers during periodic medical inspections. The disciplinary regime at Auschwitz operated through a system of calculated terror. The smallest infractions triggered disproportionate responses. Talking during work, possessing an unauthorized object, failing to remove one's cap in front of an SS officer, or simply being arbitrarily singled out for exemplary punishment. Punitive methods ranged from systematic beatings with wooden rods to cruel refinements such as suspension with arms tied behind the back, causing shoulder dislocation and gradual asphyxiation. Block 11 at Auschwitz I functioned as a prison within the camp, a place feared even by other prisoners. Its cells included confinement areas where prisoners were forced to stand in a 90 by 90 centimeter cubicle, unable to sit or lie down for days. The inner courtyard between blocks 10 and 11 housed the Black Wall, where executions by firing squad were carried out, often held in public to serve as a warning. The camp infirmaries, far from being places of recovery, functioned as antechambers of death. Access to medical treatment was extremely restricted, and medications were practically non-existent. Sick prisoners were herded into special barracks, where the even more precarious conditions accelerated their deterioration. Periodic medical selections conducted by SS doctors identified those too weakened to work who were sent directly to the gas chambers. Survival statistics revealed the lethal effectiveness of this regime. Of the approximately 1,300,000 people deported to Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945, more than 1,100,000 perished there. Most of those who survived did so because they were transferred to other camps before reaching the point of no physical return, or because they arrived in the final months of the camp's operation as the system began to disintegrate in the face of the Allied advance. The gas chambers, the real Nazi killing machine. By the spring of 1943, the Auschwitz complex completed the installation of its industrialized death system. 4 buildings designated crematoria 2, 3, 4, and 5 stood at various points in Birkenau, each meticulously designed not as simple sanitary facilities but as human processing units optimized for mass extermination. The architecture of these buildings reflected their lethal function beneath a facade of normality. Crematoria 2 and 3, built as semi-subterranean brick and concrete structures, featured entrances resembling ordinary disinfection facilities. A central corridor led to a large room called the changing room, equipped with numbered benches and hangars where deportees were instructed to leave their clothing for later retrieval. This room communicated directly with the main gas chamber, a rectangular space approximately 210 square meters with structural columns, low ceilings, and fake showers installed to maintain the illusion. Crematoria 4 and 5, of simpler construction, had their gas chambers at ground level, with small, hermetically sealed windows through which SS operators introduced the lethal agent. The integration of changing rooms, gas chambers, and crematory ovens into a single building represented the culmination of a process of technical refinement that had begun with improvised facilities such as bunkers 1 and 2, cottages adapted for the first experimental gassings. The technical design of these deadly spaces combined engineering and architectural principles with the logistics of murder. The chamber doors, reinforced with metal and equipped with thick glass peepholes, were hermetically sealed using pressure mechanisms. The ventilation systems included air intake and exhaust ducts controlled from the outside, first allowing the gas to be introduced and then exhausted to facilitate the entry of the personnel tasked with removing the bodies. The ceiling of the chambers in crematoria 2 and 3 incorporated 4 hollow columns of wire mesh that pierced the structure from the outside. Through these columns, SS officers poured Zyklon B crystals, a commercial pesticide based on hydrocyanic acid absorbed into porous granules. Upon contact with air, these crystals gradually released the lethal gas, which spread throughout the chamber. The extermination procedure followed an established protocol that combined systematic deception with technical efficiency. Transports selected for special treatment, an administrative euphemism for immediate gassing, were taken directly from the railway ramp to the crematoria. SS personnel and Sonderkommando prisoners maintained an atmosphere of apparent calm, instructing the new arrivals that they would undress for a disinfectant shower before being assigned to their barracks. Once inside the changing room, SS officers provided precise instructions. Hang clothes on numbered hangers for later retrieval, keep shoes tied together by the laces, and remember the hanger number. Sometimes small pieces of soap or towels were distributed to reinforce the illusion. This process of deception continued until the very last moment, when groups of up to 2,000 people were herded into the gas chamber. Only when the doors were hermetically sealed did the true nature of the situation become apparent. The moment of gassing represented the climax of the horror. An SS doctor supervised the process from outside, while a paramedic introduced the Zyklon B crystals through the designated openings. Within minutes, the released hydrocyanic acid caused cellular asphyxiation. The victims experienced burning eyes, progressive respiratory distress, convulsions, and finally cardiorespiratory arrest. Death generally occurred within 10 to 20 minutes, although variables such as ambient temperature, the number of people crowded together, and the dose of Zyklon B could accelerate or prolong the process. The interior layout of the chamber revealed the terrible final dynamic. The bodies were often found stacked in a pyramid shape, with the strongest at the top after their desperate attempt to reach the scarce oxygen molecules near the ceiling. Many showed signs of nasal bleeding and bloody foam around their mouths and noses. Children were frequently found at the bottom of these human pyramids, instinctively protected by their mothers until the last moment. After gassing, a forced ventilation system evacuated the toxic waste for approximately 20 minutes. Only then did the Sonderkommando, a unit composed of Jewish prisoners, forced to handle the corpses at every stage of the subsequent process, enter the scene. These men, selected for their physical strength, operated under the constant threat of immediate execution if they refused to participate or showed signs of emotional resistance to the assigned task. The Sonderkommando carried out a macabre sequence of operations with industrial efficiency. First, they separated the intertwined bodies, often finding relatives embracing each other in their final moments. Then they hosed down the corpses to remove bodily residue and gas residue. They then examined each body for valuables, hidden rings, jewelry sewn into underwear, gold teeth. A specialized team extracted the gold teeth with pliers-like instruments, depositing their loot in containers supervised by SS officers. Another group cut the women's hair, which was packed into sacks for later shipment to Germany, where it was used as stuffing for mattresses, thermal insulation for submarines, and industrial textile fiber. Nothing was wasted in this macabre economy. The corpses were transported to the crematoria by means of a system of elevators in crematoria 2 and 3, or by direct dragging in crematoria 4 and V. The bodies were placed on special stretchers and introduced into the crematoria, designed by the German company Topf & Sons specifically for Auschwitz. Each crematorium had multiple incineration furnaces, 5 triple furnaces in crematoria 2 and 3, and 2 8-muffle furnaces in crematoria 4 and 5. These furnaces, initially fueled with coke and later with a fuel mixture, operated at temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius. Although technically designed to cremate one body per muffle, the pressure to process the maximum number of corpses meant that up to 3 bodies had to be introduced simultaneously, often combining adults and children to optimize space. The cremation process took approximately 30 minutes per load, after which the unconsumed skeletal remains were manually ground into fine ash with metal mallets. These ashes were initially deposited in containers, but with the growing number of victims, especially during the mass deportation of Hungarian Jews in 1944, they began to be poured directly into the Vistula River or used as fertilizer on surrounding agricultural fields. The theoretical cremation capacity reached staggering figures, up to 4,416 bodies per day in crematoria 2 and 3 combined, and 1,920 in crematoria 4 and 5. During the height of the deportations of Hungarian Jews between May and July 1944, these facilities operated far above their rated capacity, causing frequent mechanical breakdowns. To compensate, large open-air incineration pits were dug behind Crematorium 5, where hundreds of bodies were burned simultaneously on grills improvised from railroad tracks, fueled by wood and human fat collected from the funeral pyres themselves. The operation of this system required approximately 900 prisoners divided into shifts that guaranteed uninterrupted 24-hour operations. These members of the Sonderkommando lived isolated from the rest of the camp in rooms adjacent to the crematoria, with slightly increased food rations to maintain their physical work capacity. However, their fate was sealed. Every 3 or 4 months, the entire group was liquidated and replaced by new prisoners, thus eliminating direct witnesses to the process. Despite this systematic rotation, some members of the Sonderkommando managed to partially document their experience. Manuscripts buried near the crematoria, discovered after the war, recount the technical procedures with clinical precision and the psychological impact of their forced labor with heartbreaking humanity. These Chronicles of the Abyss, written by men like Zalman Gradowski, Leib Langfuss, and Zalman Leventhal, constitute unique testimonies from the epicenter of the extermination. On October 7, 1944, aware of their inevitable liquidation, members of the Sonderkommando organized a desperate rebellion. Using rudimentary explosives smuggled from the Union munitions factory, where prisoners from the women's camp were working, they attacked SS guards and partially burned down Crematorium 4. This act of resistance, although quickly suppressed with the execution of all 451 participants, remains a symbol of human dignity in the face of the machinery of genocide. Beginning in November 1944, faced with the advance of the Red Army, camp authorities began the gradual dismantling of the extermination facilities. Crematoria 2 and 3 were partially demolished with explosives, while parts of the technical equipment were dismantled for transport to other camps. These actions were part of a systematic effort to eliminate evidence of the genocide, which included the burning of administrative records and the scattering of human ashes. However, the magnitude of the extermination operation prevented its complete concealment. When Soviet troops liberated Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, they found incontrovertible evidence: intact sections of the crematoria, dental extraction instruments, Zyklon B canisters, and tons of the victims' personal belongings. These material remains, along with survivor testimonies and salvaged administrative documentation, have made it possible to accurately reconstruct the workings of this industrialized death machine that represented the technical and organizational culmination of the Nazi genocide. The pain laboratories, the most perverse side of Nazi medicine. Within the perimeter of Auschwitz, where death had become an industrial process, another level of horror emerged under the guise of medical science. Inside Block 10 of Auschwitz I and in designated barracks at Birkenau, academically trained doctors transformed Hippocratic principles into their antithesis. Instead of healing, they deliberately harmed. Instead of alleviating suffering, they methodically intensified it. Block 10 was notable for its ordinary exterior, indistinguishable from the other brick buildings in the main camp. However, its interior had been adapted as a human laboratory: observation rooms, rudimentary surgical tables, X-ray equipment, and confinement spaces for experimental subjects. Here, under the guise of scientific research, procedures were performed that in any ordinary medical context would have been considered absolute ethical aberrations. The medical staff conducting these experiments was not composed of fringe fanatics, but professionals with impeccable academic credentials. Josef Mengele, perhaps the most infamous of these doctors, held a doctorate in anthropology and a medical degree from the University of Frankfurt. Karl Klauberg was a renowned gynecologist with pre-war scientific publications. Eduard Wörths, the camp's chief physician, had served as a respected rural doctor before joining the SS. This combination of rigorous scientific training and absolute moral disengagement created the conditions for a systematic perversion of medicine. The experiments conducted at Auschwitz can be categorized into three broad groups: genetic research, physical endurance testing, and the development of mass sterilization methods. Each line of experimentation responded to specific objectives of the Nazi regime, ranging from the pseudo-scientific validation of racial theories to military or demographic applications. Mengele focused his attention on twins, particularly children, for their value in comparative studies. His methodology followed an established pattern. Upon the arrival of transports at the ramp, he would personally examine the lines for pairs of twins. When he identified them, he drew them from the general selection, regardless of their age or physical condition, housing them in special barracks designated Mengele's zoo by other prisoners. The experimental procedure began with exhaustive documentation, precise anthropometric measurements, systematic photographs from multiple angles, dental molds, and detailed records of every physical characteristic. The twins underwent regular blood draws, lumbar punctures without anesthesia, and repeated X-rays without radiation protection. Mengele looked for correlations between external physical characteristics and internal structures, attempting to identify genetic markers of racial inferiority. The most horrific phase of these experiments came when Mengele ordered comparative surgical procedures. One twin underwent an intervention, organ removal, cross-fertilization, or inoculation with pathogens, while the other served as a control. If one died during the procedure, the second was killed by lethal injection for simultaneous comparative autopsies. The removed organs were preserved in formalin and sent to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin for further analysis. Of the approximately 3,000 twins who passed through Mengeler's laboratory, only 200 survived. The testimonies of these survivors describe not only the physical pain of procedures performed without adequate anesthesia, but also the psychological trauma of watching siblings mutilated while they waited their turn. In parallel to his twin studies, Mengele conducted research on individuals with congenital physical abnormalities, cases of dwarfism, gigantism, and heterochromia, eyes of different colors. The Auschwitz family, a group of artists with dwarfism, was preserved as a whole for these studies. For 18 months, they underwent systematic extractions of bone marrow, teeth, and muscle fragments, always without anesthesia. Their survival was due solely to their value as rare specimens. In another sector of Auschwitz, Dr. Horst Schumann conducted radiation sterilization experiments. His procedure involved exposing prisoners' testicles and ovaries to concentrated doses of X-rays, subsequently observing the destructive effects on gonadal tissue. The men were positioned in front of an X-ray machine that directed radiation directly at their genitals for several minutes, with no protection for the rest of their bodies. Days or weeks after exposure, Schumann surgically removed the testicles for histological analysis. These procedures, often performed with unsterilized instruments and minimal anesthesia, caused severe infections, tissue necrosis, and uncontrollable bleeding. Surviving victims experienced external radiation burns, chronic pain, and, effectively, permanent sterility, albeit at an unacceptably high human cost for a mass sterilization program. Simultaneously, in the same Block 10, Karl Kloberg was developing an alternative method of non-surgical female sterilization. His technique involved injecting irritating chemicals directly into the uterus, causing severe inflammation that led to scarring and blockage of the fallopian tubes. He used a combination of formaldehyde, silver nitrate, and other caustic compounds, injected under pressure without anesthesia or basic aseptic conditions. In June 1943, satisfied with his preliminary results, Klauberg wrote to Himmler, "The method of non-surgical sterilization I have developed is practically perfected. An experienced doctor with 10 assistants can perform the sterilization of 1,000 women in a single day." This industrialization of forced sterilization reflected the same mentality that had turned murder into a factory process in the adjacent crematoria. Other experiments at Auschwitz explored the limits of human endurance, often with military applications in mind. Prisoners were submerged in tanks of ice-cold water to study the effects of hypothermia and test resuscitation methods for German pilots shot down over frigid waters. Others were subjected to decompression chambers simulating extreme altitudes, suffering air embolisms, convulsions, and death by asphyxiation while doctors timed their endurance. Thirst tolerance tests required groups of Roma to drink only chemically treated seawater, observing its progressive degradation leading to fatal dehydration. Various infectious agents were also experimented with: typhus, malaria, gas gangrene, infectious hepatitis. Prisoners were deliberately inoculated and left untreated to document the natural progression of the disease, potentially useful information for military medical units. The clinical coldness of the documentation contrasts with the reality of the suffering it recorded. The medical reports, written in precise technical language, detailed body temperatures, levels of consciousness, and blood test results while failing to mention the screams, pleas, and agony of the subjects. Clinical photographs depicted injuries, deformities, or pathological processes as if the patients were mere anonymous specimens rather than human beings. The selection of subjects for these experiments followed explicitly racial criteria. Jews, Gypsies, and Slavic prisoners were considered disposable material. Doctors justified this treatment through a perversion of the Hippocratic Oath. They argued that their primary loyalty was to the German national body, and that the suffering of racially inferior individuals was justifiable if it generated useful knowledge for German medicine. Institutional involvement extended responsibility beyond individual doctors. the University of Strasbourg, the SS Hygiene Institute, the pharmaceutical company Bayer, part of IG Farben, and various university hospitals received samples, analyses, or experimental results. This academic and industrial collaboration provided a veneer of scientific legitimacy to essentially criminal procedures. The final fate of the experimental subjects was predetermined. Those who survived the procedures, often with permanent damage, were executed by lethal injection of phenol directly into the heart to allow autopsies without post-mortem changes that would skew the results. Whole bodies or specific organs were sent to German medical institutions for further study, labeled with identification numbers that concealed their human origin. Paradoxically, the Nazi bureaucratic meticulousness left records that would later allow these crimes to be documented: equipment requests, periodic reports, correspondence between departments, and archived photographs provided incontrovertible evidence during the Nuremberg trials and subsequent court proceedings. However, many of the implicated doctors escaped justice. Mengele escaped to South America, where he lived until 1979 without facing trial. Kloberg, after a brief imprisonment in the Soviet Union, attempted to resume his medical practice in Germany before his arrest in 1955, dying before being tried. The legacy of these experiments poses persistent ethical dilemmas. Knowledge obtained through torture and murder is irremediably tainted, but some observations on hypothermia or extreme physiology found their way into contemporary medical literature, generally without acknowledgement of their origin. Following the Nuremberg trials, the international medical community developed specific ethical codes for human research, establishing informed consent as an absolute and non-negotiable requirement. The few survivors of these experiments carried with them not only physical scars but also profound psychological trauma. Many experienced what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, with recurring nightmares, chronic anxiety, and a lifelong distrust of medical settings. For some, like Eva Moses Kaur, a survivor of the twin experiments, the path to personal recovery included the radical act of forgiveness. For others, the only possible response was persistent witnessing that would ensure these events would never be forgotten or repeated. The women of Auschwitz, raped, beaten, forgotten. In March 1942, to the barking of German orders and the crack of whips, an initial group of 999 Jewish women transferred from the Ravensbrück camp passed through the gates of Birkenau. With their freshly shaved heads and weakened bodies, they marked the formal creation of the women's camp at Auschwitz, a space where the general horror of the complex took on specifically feminine dimensions. The women's section initially occupied Sector B1A of Birkenau, a rectangular area bordered by electrified barbed wire fences with a theoretical capacity for around 20,000 prisoners, although it could hold up to 30,000 at peak times. The area was divided into subsections by additional barbed wire fences, creating isolated blocks that facilitated control and prevented communication between groups. The women suffered the same inhumane conditions described above for the entire camp, but with specific vulnerabilities related to their female condition. The complete absence of menstrual hygiene products constituted an additional form of degradation. The communal toilets were equally rudimentary, long cement gutters with widely spaced faucets that provided non-potable water at set times. The complete lack of hygiene products, soap or sanitary napkins created degrading conditions, especially during menstruation. The prisoners resorted to improvising with scraps of rag or paper when available, necessarily reusing them throughout their cycle. The search and dehumanization process was similar to that described for all prisoners, but included elements of humiliation, specifically targeting women. For observant Jewish women, the tattoo also represented a spiritual violation, as their faith prohibited body modification. The administrative structure of the women's camp mirrored the general system at Auschwitz, but with its own unique characteristics. Initially overseen by male SS guards in 1942, control shifted primarily to female guards, the Aufseherinnen, German women recruited for service. Unlike male SS guards, these guards required no prior political affiliation and received only 6 weeks of training before assuming absolute authority over thousands of prisoners. Some Aufseherinnen achieved notoriety for their exceptional brutality. Maria Mandel, the women's camp's chief supervisor and known as the Beast, introduced specific refinements to the punishments. She forced prisoners to kneel on sharp gravel for hours or to hold their arms raised, holding heavy stones until they collapsed. Irma Gress, barely 20 years old, used a wire-reinforced whip and unleashed her trained dog on weak prisoners. Under this external supervision, internal administration operated through a hierarchy of prisoner functionaries. Blokower, head of barracks, and Stubower, head of section, were selected from among veteran prisoners, usually non-Jewish. They received minimal privileges, slightly larger rations, access to extra clothing, in exchange for maintaining order and the productivity of their subordinates. This structure created deliberate internal divisions, undermining the natural solidarity among victims. Female prisoners performed many of the same labor tasks as men, but some assignments specifically exploited their feminine status or skills traditionally associated with women. The women's work regime in the fields included various assignments, all characterized by disproportionate physical demands on bodies weakened by chronic malnutrition. Other prisoners were assigned to agricultural work in surrounding fields, where they grew vegetables intended exclusively for the SS, while they subsisted on minimal rations. Industrial commandos sent groups to nearby factories such as the Union Armaments Plant, where they produced munitions components in 12-hour shifts. Construction and maintenance work required moving heavy materials, digging ditches, or cleaning latrines, often under extreme weather conditions without adequate protective clothing. Motherhood within Auschwitz represented a double death sentence. Women identified as pregnant during the initial selection were sent directly to the gas chambers. Those whose pregnancies became apparent after admission faced two possible fates before 1944: forced abortion followed by a return to work, or selection for medical experimentation under the supervision of doctors like Karl Klauberg or Josef Mengele. Births within the camp before 1944 invariably ended in tragedy. Births took place in absolutely primitive conditions without proper medical care or basic hygiene measures. If both mother and newborn survived, both were typically sent to the gas chambers, or in some documented cases, the newborn was killed by lethal injection or drowning by SS medical personnel. Only for a brief period between 1944 and 1945, on Himmler's direct orders in response to changing political considerations, were some babies born in the camp allowed to survive with their mothers. A rudimentary nursery was established in Block 17 at Birkenau. However, conditions remained so precarious that most of these infants did not survive beyond a few weeks due to malnutrition, exposure to the cold, or infectious diseases. The disciplinary system applied to female prisoners included punishments specifically designed to humiliate aspects of female identity. Punitive shaving, carried out publicly for minor offenses, exploited the cultural connection between hair and femininity. Forced exposure, forcing women to remain naked for hours in the camp's central plaza, sometimes in sub-zero temperatures, instrumentalized physical vulnerability and modesty as mechanisms of control. The physical punishments administered by the Aufseherinnen displayed particular cruelty. The blows were frequently directed at sensitive areas such as the breasts, genitals, or lower abdomen, causing permanent reproductive damage. Some particularly sadistic guards developed personalized techniques. Irma Gress was known to specifically hit the breasts of young prisoners. Elisabeth Ruppert forced strenuous gymnastics to the point of collapse. Juana Bormann used her trained German Shepherd to attack arbitrarily selected prisoners. Systemic sexual assault took multiple forms, from direct violence to institutionalized coercion. Although technically prohibited by Nazi racial laws, the rape of female prisoners occurred with impunity, particularly during transfers or labor outside the main camp. More systematic was the selection of young women for forced brothels established at Auschwitz I, where they were forced to sexually service privileged prisoners as a perverse incentive to increase productivity. Periodic selections within the women's camp followed specific criteria. In addition to obvious physical weakness, signs of illness, or inability to work, women were evaluated for their appearance. Those deemed unaesthetic according to arbitrary standards, facial scars, body asymmetry, skin blemishes, were frequently singled out for elimination, revealing the perverse aesthetic dimension of the Nazi concept of life unworthy of life. Despite these conditions, specific forms of female resistance and solidarity emerged. Country families formed, groups of women who shared scarce food, cared for each other during illness, and provided critical emotional support. These informal, often intergenerational structures recreated lost family ties and significantly increased the chances of survival. Organized resistance also found expression among prisoners. The most well-documented case is that of Rosa Robota alla Gärtner, Regina Safferstein, and Esther Weichblum, who, while working at the Union Munitions Factory, smuggled small quantities of gunpowder hidden in hems or wrapped in makeshift sanitary napkins. This explosive material, delivered to the Sonderkommando, enabled the partially successful rebellion of October 1944 that destroyed Crematorium 4. The 4 women were captured, brutally tortured, and publicly hanged on January 6, 1945. Other forms of resistance included clandestine education, particularly among Polish prisoners, the secret practice of religious rituals, and artistic creation. Collectively memorized poems, orally transmitted songs, and small drawings on stolen materials preserved fragments of humanity in an environment designed to eradicate it. The mental recording of atrocities with the explicit intention of later bearing witness if one survived constituted another act of resistance, the determination to let the world know the truth. As the Red Army approached in January 1945, approximately 15,000 women were evacuated from Birkenau. Weakened by years of malnutrition and disease, forced to march in extreme winter conditions without adequate shelter, thousands perished during these death marches. The approximately 2,000 women too sick to walk were abandoned in the camp, where Soviet troops discovered them on January 27th. The Auschwitz women's camp represents a specific chapter within the broader horror of the Holocaust, a space where gender vulnerability intersected with racial and political persecution, creating unique experiences of suffering. Of the approximately 200,000 women who passed through its barbed wire, only 30,000 survived. Their testimonies reveal both the depth of human suffering and the extraordinary capacity to maintain dignity and solidarity even in the most extreme circumstances. The Last March, how the Nazis tried to erase Auschwitz. By mid-January 1945, the Eastern Front was rapidly crumbling. Soviet divisions were advancing into German territory at a pace that alarmed the Nazi high command. Heinrich Himmler, aware of the implications of the Auschwitz complex falling intact into enemy hands, issued the evacuation order that would set in motion the final phase of the camp's history. On January 17th, under a leaden sky that foreshadowed a blizzard, the SS commanders at Auschwitz received the official telegram ordering the complete evacuation of the complex. This was not simply a logistical relocation, but a dual-purpose operation to prevent Soviet forces from finding physical evidence of the systematic extermination and to prevent thousands of prisoners, potential witnesses, from recounting what had happened. The camp's administrative machinery immediately began preparations for this mass evacuation. The following days were filled with frantic activity. Teams of selected prisoners worked under armed supervision, destroying administrative documents, partially dismantling gassing and cremation facilities, and erasing physical evidence of the genocide. The crematorium chimneys, which had emitted constant smoke for years, were blown up. The destruction of the extermination facilities was carried out hastily, but the scale of the genocidal operation prevented its complete concealment. Sufficient material evidence would remain to document these crimes. At the same time, prisoner columns were organized for evacuation. Of the approximately 67,000 inmates remaining in the complex, about 58,000 were deemed fit to march. The selection criteria were brutally simple. Those who could stand would be evacuated. The remaining approximately 9,000 people too sick or weak to walk would be left to their fate. Between January 17th and 21st, 1945, in the midst of the Polish winter, with temperatures frequently dropping below -20 degrees Celsius, what survivors would later call the death marches began. The prisoners, grouped in columns of 500 to 1,000 people guarded by armed SS guards, began their journeys on foot to railway stations 55 to 63 kilometers away, from where they would be transported to other concentration camps within the Reich. The conditions of these forced marches represented perhaps the ultimate expression of the concentration camp's systematic cruelty. Dressed in lightweight striped cotton uniforms, often without coats or proper footwear, the prisoners advanced on snow-covered roads. Food supplies were practically non-existent. Many received a single ration of bread at the start of the march, insufficient for several days of extreme physical exertion. The instructions to the SS guards were explicit. Any prisoner who lingered, collapsed from exhaustion, or attempted to escape was to be executed immediately. Accounts from survivors and Polish civilians who witnessed these columns describe paths marked by corpses in the snow. Some prisoners, knowing they would be unable to keep up, voluntarily moved a few meters away from the path before being shot, preferring a quick death to the agonizing combination of exhaustion and freezing. It is estimated that approximately 15,000 people perished during these evacuations, killed for falling behind or overcome by a lethal combination of hypothermia, exhaustion, and malnutrition. Those who survived were transported to camps such as Gross-Rosen, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, and Bergen-Belsen, where many would die before the final liberation by the Allies in April-May 1945. As evacuee columns crossed the winter landscape, Auschwitz was gradually abandoned. The last SS contingents hastily destroyed archives and detonated explosive charges in the remaining crematoria. On January 23, 1945, they conducted a final inspection and began their own withdrawal westward, leaving behind a complex virtually empty, except for approximately 9,000 prisoners deemed non-evacuable. These abandoned prisoners, most of them terminally ill, lived through days of absolute uncertainty. Without security personnel but too weak to escape, without organized food but occasionally assisted by prisoners who had managed to hide to avoid evacuation, they survived in a limbo between certain death and a seemingly improbable liberation. On January 27, 1945, advance units of the 60th Army of the Red Army's 1st Ukrainian Front finally reached the perimeter of Auschwitz. The first Soviet soldiers to enter, including Lieutenant Elisaveta Gromova, encountered scenes that defied human comprehension. In the documented words of Major Anatoly Shapiro, who commanded the first unit to enter Auschwitz I, "We could not understand how the men, women, and children we found were still alive. They were skeletons. They were dressed in soaking wet striped uniforms and had been abandoned without food or hot water for days." Throughout the complex, including Birkenau, soldiers encountered similar scenes of extreme desolation. Hundreds of bodies lay unburied among the barracks. Many survivors were so weakened they could not move from their bunks, and some, in a state of shock or delirium from typhoid fever, did not even initially understand that they had been liberated. The Soviets' first actions were pragmatic and urgent. Military medical teams set up temporary field hospitals in former administrative buildings. Medical interventions had to be carried out with extreme caution. Mobile kitchens were set up to provide food, but many prisoners, desperately hungry, suffered severe intestinal complications from quickly ingesting regular food after years of starvation. Approximately 300 survivors died in the weeks following liberation, their bodies too weakened to recover even with medical care. The magnitude of the health situation soon overwhelmed available military resources. Assistance was sought from the Polish civilian population of Oświęcim and the surrounding area. Many responded by bringing food, clothing, and medicine, although there were also documented cases where the local population, imbued with persistent anti-Semitism, refused to provide assistance to the Jewish survivors. In parallel with the rescue operations, the systematic documentation process immediately began. The Soviet State Extraordinary Commission for the Investigation of War Crimes accompanied the military units for precisely this purpose.